The wet season rain hammered down on Phuoc Tuy Province like a physical weight. Corporal Bob Bluey Henderson of 6th Royal Australian Regiment crouched in the elephant grass, water streaming down his face, his finger resting against the trigger guard of his SLR. It was February 22nd, 1966, and the 12-man patrol from D Company had been tracking Viet Cong movement for 3 days through terrain that could swallow a man whole. The silence bothered him more than the rain. Henderson had grown up in the Queensland bush, where silence meant something was wrong. Here, 20 kilometers northeast of Vung Tau, that instinct screamed at him. The usual jungle symphony, the birds, the insects, the distant howler monkeys, had stopped. In its place, nothing but rain and the thundering of his own heartbeat. "Boss," he whispered into his radio handset, barely audible even to himself. "Something's not right." Lieutenant Jim Shelton, positioned 10 meters ahead, raised his fist. The patrol froze. 12 men scattered across 30 meters of jungle, invisible even to each other, suddenly became statues. They'd rehearsed this drill 100 times at Shoalwater Bay, but training never prepared you for the weight of real danger pressing down like the monsoon clouds overhead. What Henderson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that they'd walked into the middle of a 275th Viet Cong Regiment staging area. 200 guerrillas surrounded them. In conventional military thinking, they were already dead men. The Viet Cong had numbers, prepared positions, and the advantage of surprise. But the Australians had something else. Something the Americans, with their search and destroy operations and body count obsessions, had missed entirely. And in the next 4 hours, that difference would mean everything. When Australia committed combat troops to South Vietnam in 1965, military analysts in Saigon barely gave them a second thought. The Australian task force, initially just 2 battalions totaling around 1,500 men, seemed almost quaint compared to the massive American buildup. General William Westmoreland was deploying entire divisions. By 1966, he commanded over 400,000 American troops pursuing his doctrine of aggressive search and destroy operations designed to bleed the enemy through attrition. The Australian approach drew polite dismissal from American planners. "Too slow," one MACV officer noted in a briefing. "Too cautious. This isn't Malaya. We need to take the fight to Charlie, not patrol around like park rangers." But Brigadier Oliver David O.D. Jackson, commander of the 1st Australian Task Force, had different ideas. A veteran of jungle warfare in Malaya and Borneo, Jackson understood something the Americans seemed determined to ignore. You couldn't kill your way to victory against an enemy who controlled when and where to fight. The Americans treat Vietnam like Kansas with palm trees, Jackson told his officers during a planning session at Nui Dat Base. They fly in, shoot everything that moves, pile up bodies, and fly out. Then Charlie comes back. We're going to do something they find deeply unfashionable. We're going to stay. The Australian doctrine emphasized what they called counter-insurgency warfare, a methodology refined through 12 years of operations against communist insurgents in Malaya. The principles seemed almost pedestrian compared to American firepower doctrine. Establish permanent bases, conduct continuous patrolling, gather intelligence, separate the guerrillas from civilian support, and maintain constant pressure without overcommitting to major battles. Major General Tim Vincent, who commanded Australian forces in Borneo, had put it simply: "You can't win a guerrilla war by being a better guerrilla. You win by being more professional, better trained, better disciplined, better at the small things that keep men alive and missions successful." This philosophy mystified American observers. Where Americans measured success in body counts and operations launched, Australians tracked different metrics. Enemy supply lines disrupted, villages secured, intelligence gathered, Ambushes successful versus casualties sustained. The Americans wanted spectacular victories. The Australians wanted sustainable results. The patrol doctrine reflected this difference. Australian patrols were smaller, typically 10-12 men, rather than platoon or company-sized American operations. They moved slowly, sometimes covering less than a kilometer per day. They stopped frequently to listen. They avoided trails. They left no trace of their passage. One Australian officer joked that his men spent more time standing still than moving, like very aggressive statues. American troops often moved with helicopter support, artillery on call, and airstrikes available within minutes. Australian patrols in 1966 frequently operated beyond immediate support range, relying on stealth, discipline, and skill to survive contact with superior enemy forces. The Yanks think we're timid, Sergeant Major Jack McInnes of 5 RAR observed. They don't understand the difference between timid and patient. A tiger in the grass isn't timid. It's waiting for the right moment. But even among Australian commanders, few imagined just how effective that patience could be. In early 1966, the doctrine remained largely theoretical in Vietnamese jungle conditions. The patrol on February 22nd would provide the first dramatic proof of concept. Though none of the men slogging through the rain that day were thinking about doctrine. They were thinking about staying alive. The Australian military's approach to Vietnam was forged not in Saigon or Washington, but in the jungles of Malaya between 1950 and 1960. There, Australian troops had fought alongside British forces against the Malayan National Liberation Army, a communist insurgency that, on paper, should have overwhelmed the colonial forces. The Malayan Emergency taught hard lessons. Early British operations followed conventional military logic. Sweep through suspected insurgent areas with large forces, engage the enemy, withdraw. The communists simply melted into the jungle and returned. For years, the insurgency grew despite military operations that looked successful in after-action reports. Then the British changed tactics under General Harold Briggs and later General Gerald Templer. They established fortified patrol bases in insurgent territory. They sent out small, highly trained patrols that stayed in the jungle for weeks. They focused on intelligence gathering over body counts. They separated insurgents from civilian support through hearts and minds operations rather than firepower. Most critically, they learned to fight the guerrilla's way. Small unit actions, ambushes, patience, and persistence, but with superior training and discipline. Australian units, particularly the Special Air Service, SAS, excelled at this approach. By the time the emergency ended in 1960, Australian military doctrine had fundamentally shifted toward counter-insurgency. Captain Peter Schumann, who served in both Malaya and later Vietnam, described the transformation. In Malaya, we learned that 6 well-trained men who know the jungle and practice fire discipline are more effective than 60 blokes thrashing about like bulls in a china shop. The Americans never learned that lesson, or maybe they learned it but couldn't apply it because their whole military structure demands large-scale operations. When Australia committed to Vietnam, they brought this institutional knowledge. The training regime at Canungra in Queensland and Shoalwater Bay exposed soldiers to jungle warfare techniques most American units never saw. Australian infantrymen learned to move silently in formation, maintain visual contact without radios, read enemy signs in vegetation, and above all, practice fire discipline. Fire discipline represented perhaps the greatest doctrinal difference between Australian and American approaches. American units often employed reconnaissance by fire, shooting at suspected enemy positions to provoke a response. Australian doctrine forbade firing unless absolutely necessary. An Australian patrol leader who allowed his men to fire unnecessarily could face discipline. Every time you pull a trigger, you tell the enemy exactly where you are. Warrant Officer Keith Payne explained during training sessions. In the bush, your greatest weapon isn't your rifle, it's invisibility. Once you're visible, you're vulnerable. The patrol composition reflected this philosophy. A typical Australian patrol included a patrol leader, usually a lieutenant or experienced sergeant, a patrol second in command, a forward scout, the most experienced soldier, a radio operator, riflemen trained in immediate action drills, a rear scout to watch for trackers. Each man carried 60-70 pounds of equipment: rifle, ammunition, grenades, water, rations for 5 days, radio batteries, medical supplies, and survival gear. Unlike American units, they typically operated without resupply until mission completion. The patrol tactics emphasized what Australians called close country drills, immediate action responses to contact at ranges of 10 to 50 meters, where the jungle typically limited visibility. They rehearsed ambush drills until they became muscle memory. Instant response without verbal commands, controlled fire, immediate tactical movement, never remaining static under fire. By February 1966, 6 RAR had been in country for 2 months, conducting operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. The area, roughly the size of Long Island, represented the task force's tactical responsibility. It was a guerrilla's paradise. Triple canopy jungle, rubber plantations, rice paddies, scattered villages, and the long high hills providing observation and base areas. Intelligence reports indicated substantial Viet Cong presence, including elements of the 274th and 275th VC regiments, main force units with military training and equipment. These weren't village guerrillas with ancient rifles. They were disciplined soldiers with modern weapons, military organization, and extensive combat experience. D Company's patrol orders for February 22nd seemed routine. Conduct reconnaissance of a suspected enemy staging area northeast of Vung Tau. Gather intelligence, avoid contact if possible. Report enemy positions. It was the kind of patrol Australian units conducted daily. Slow, methodical, professional. Lieutenant Shelton briefed his men the night before. We're eyes and ears, not a hammer. We find them, we report them, we get out. We don't fight unless we have to. Nobody expected they'd have to fight. Nobody expected the Viet Cong had already found them. And nobody expected what would happen when 12 men faced 200. Henderson saw the first one at 14:30 hours. A flash of black through the green, someone moving parallel to the patrol, maybe 30 meters off. His hand shot up in the standard enemy-sighted signal. Fist closed, thumb extended. The patrol froze again. Shelton crawled backward to Henderson's position, moving with excruciating slowness. In the jungle, sound traveled strangely, sometimes carrying whispers hundreds of meters, sometimes swallowing shouts at 10 paces. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of equipment could mean death. Where? Shelton's lips formed the word without sound. Henderson pointed. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then the entire jungle seemed to shift. Not one person moving, dozens. Through gaps in the foliage, Henderson caught glimpses. Black pajamas, AK-47s, equipment webbing, moving in organized groups. This wasn't a patrol. This was a unit preparing for operations. Shelton's face remained impassive, but his hand signals told the story. Enemy in strength. Prepared defensive positions. Absolute silence. The 12 Australians began the most delicate maneuver of their lives. Each man slowly, incrementally, moved into position to create an all-around defensive circle, maintaining visual contact with adjacent soldiers while watching their assigned sectors. Private Danny Nguyen, the patrol's Vietnamese-Australian interpreter, estimated enemy strength by counting the groups he could see and multiplying. At least 200, boss. maybe more. The mathematics were brutal. 12 men, 12 rifles, limited ammunition, no artillery support immediately available, helicopters 30 minutes away at best. Against an enemy force with more than 15-to-1 numerical superiority, prepared positions, and the advantage of surprise. American doctrine would have called for immediate extraction. Australian doctrine called for something else. Shelton made the decision that would define the next 4 hours. Instead of requesting emergency extraction and risking movement that might trigger immediate contact, he radioed a sitrep in whispered codes. Heavy enemy presence. Request fire mission coordinates. Holding position. At the fire base, artillery officers scrambled. Captain Mike Deek, the battery commander, ran calculations. The patrol was at extreme range, 19 to 800 meters from the nearest 105mm guns. At that distance, accuracy degraded significantly. Worse, the jungle canopy meant airburst rounds would be ineffective. Everything would have to be impact detonation, and with friendlies' danger close, the margin for error approached zero. "Can you adjust?" Deek radioed back. "Affirmative," Shelton replied, standing by. What happened next would be recounted in Australian military academies for decades. Shelton was about to conduct what would later be called the most precisely directed artillery mission of the Vietnam War, calling fire danger close to his own position while surrounded by enemy forces who didn't yet know he was there. At 14:45 hours, the first 100mm round screamed overhead and detonated 200 meters north of the patrol. The explosion was catastrophic, a column of mud, vegetation, and shrapnel erupting skyward. Henderson felt the concussion wave through his chest. The Viet Cong response was immediate and revealing. Instead of scattering, they moved toward the explosion in organized groups, a reconnaissance element investigating the strike. They still didn't know an enemy patrol was within their perimeter. Shelton whispered corrections. Right 100, add 50. Another round, closer. The VC now showed confusion, some elements moving away from the impact area, others holding position, commanders shouting orders. Right 50, drop 25. The third round landed 150 meters from the Australian position. Close enough that dirt and debris rained down through the canopy. Close enough that Henderson could smell the explosive residue. The Viet Cong were now moving in multiple directions. Some elements displaced south, directly toward the Australian position. Others moved to investigate the artillery strikes. The organization was breaking down into chaos. "Fire for effect," Shelton ordered. "All guns." The firebase opened up. 6 105mm howitzers firing in sequence, rounds arriving every few seconds. The jungle erupted, trees exploded, the ground heaved. The noise became a physical presence, a continuous thunder that pressed down on everything. Henderson watched VC soldiers running through the smoke, some carrying wounded, others firing blindly into the jungle. Several groups passed within 20 meters of Australian positions, close enough to see faces, expressions of confusion and fear. Not one Australian fired. "Hold fire." Shelton's voice remained steady over the patrol radio net. Absolute fire discipline. It violated every instinct. Enemy soldiers were right there, exposed, vulnerable. But opening fire would reveal the patrol's position. Once revealed, numerical superiority would tell. 12 rifles against 200 would last minutes. The artillery walked through the enemy position for 30 minutes. Shelton made 17 separate adjustments, each based on where he saw enemy movement, each bringing high explosive death closer to his own men. At one point, shrapnel struck a tree 10 meters from Private John Walsh, showering him with splinters. He didn't move. By 15-20 hours, the Viet Cong were in full retreat. Bodies littered the jungle floor. Henderson would later estimate at least 40 dead, visible from his position alone. The survivors fled west in disorganized groups, abandoning equipment, weapons, and wounded. Shelton waited another 20 minutes. The jungle grew quiet again, except for the moans of wounded VC soldiers too injured to move. Then he made the call. Request extraction. L's to be cleared by artillery. The firebase fired smoke rounds to mark the landing zone 300 meters north of the patrol position. The 12 Australians began moving, still maintaining patrol discipline despite the carnage surrounding them. They stopped frequently, listened, observed. This wasn't a rout. This was a tactical withdrawal by professionals who knew the jungle could still kill them. The helicopters came in low and fast at 1600 hours. 12 men loaded in under 30 seconds and were gone, leaving behind the shattered remains of a VC battalion staging area. The after-action report recorded the statistics clinically. Enemy casualties estimated 40 to 60 KIA, numerous wounded. Friendly casualties, nil. Ammunition expended, 0 rounds small arms. That last number told the whole story. 12 men had faced 200, called artillery danger close to their own position, maintained absolute fire discipline under conditions that would break most units, and walked away without firing a shot or losing a man. The February 22nd patrol became legend within 1 ATF, but its lessons were analyzed with clinical precision. What emerged wasn't just one patrol's lucky break. It was proof that the Australian doctrinal approach worked in Vietnamese jungle conditions. Major General Ken McKay, who later commanded Australian forces in Vietnam, studied the patrol's actions exhaustively. What Shelton's patrol demonstrated was that small unit excellence, fire discipline, and proper use of supporting arms could overcome massive numerical disadvantage. But more importantly, they demonstrated that you could win without fighting, which is the essence of counter-insurgency warfare. The Australian High Command doubled down on patrol-based operations. While American units conducted large-scale search and destroy sweeps with hundreds of soldiers, Australian battalions spread into the countryside in dozens of small patrols, creating a web of intelligence gathering and enemy disruption. Between February and August 1966, Australian patrols made contact with enemy forces 127 times. In only 18 of those contacts did Australians fire their weapons. The other 109 times, they used artillery, air support, or simply reported enemy positions and withdrew. Yet Australian intelligence assessments showed they were disrupting enemy operations more effectively than American units operating in adjacent provinces. The evolution showed in patrol tactics. Commanders began deliberately positioning patrols within artillery range of suspected enemy positions, effectively using 12-man patrols as forward observers for devastating artillery strikes. The patrol became the reconnaissance element of a larger weapon system. Fire discipline remained paramount. Sergeant Major Bruce McWalter instituted a policy in 5 RAR. Any soldier who fired without permission on patrol would be removed from patrol duty permanently. I don't care if you see Ho Chi Minh himself with a sign saying, "Shoot me." If the patrol commander hasn't ordered fire, you don't pull the trigger. McWalter told new arrivals. Your rifle is your last resort, not your first. The Viet Cong adapted too, but their adaptations revealed Australian effectiveness. VC intelligence summaries captured in 1967 showed they classified Australian units as special forces, requiring different engagement protocols than American forces. One captured document instructed, Australian patrols move silently, do not reveal positions, and call artillery very close. Do not assume small Australian patrols can be easily defeated. Avoid contact unless advantage is certain. By mid-1966, the VC began avoiding areas of known Australian patrol activity entirely. The 275th Regiment, which had suffered heavily in the February engagement and subsequent operations, moved its base areas 15 kilometers further west, outside the regular Australian patrol range. But the greatest evolution came in joint operations with American units. The contrast in approaches created friction, but also opportunities. In July 1966, D Company 6 RAR conducted a coordinated operation with the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade. The American battalion conducted a sweep through a suspected VC area with 600 troops. They made contact, engaged in a heavy firefight, claimed 40 enemy KIA, and withdrew after 8 hours. Australian patrols, operating in the same general area but using their standard tactics, identified the VC withdrawal routes and called artillery strikes on enemy forces moving away from the American sweep. Australian after-action reports estimated an additional 30 enemy casualties, with 0 Australian losses and minimal ammunition expended. Major Harry Smith, who would later command in the Battle of Long Tan, observed the operation. The Americans are aggressive, courageous, and well-equipped. But they fight like they're back in Europe. Big formations, heavy firepower, occupy ground, withdraw. The VC just wait them out. Our approach is different. We're not trying to occupy ground, we're trying to make the enemy think we're everywhere and nowhere at once. That's much harder to fight against. Individual Australian soldiers became extraordinarily skilled. The average Australian infantryman in Vietnam spent more time on patrol than in base, sometimes 25 days per month in the jungle. They developed almost preternatural senses for enemy presence. Corporal Jim Kelly of 2 RAR described it. After 6 months of patrolling, you could feel when something was wrong. The jungle would be too quiet, or the birds would change their behavior. You just know. And that knowledge kept you alive. Navigation skills reached exceptional levels. Patrols routinely operated for days without using trails or obvious terrain features, navigating by compass bearing alone through triple canopy jungle where GPS would be useless even if it existed. They maintained position awareness to within 50 meters, even after moving several kilometers through featureless jungle. Medical capabilities evolved too. Every patrol member received advanced first aid training. They could treat gunshot wounds, perform emergency tracheotomies, stabilize fractures, and administer IV fluids under fire. The Australian casualty survival rate in Vietnam exceeded 95%, higher than American rates despite longer evacuation times. The Viet Cong noticed. A North Vietnamese officer, Colonel Tran Van Tra, wrote in his memoirs, "The Australian soldiers were well-trained and determined. They did not operate like the Americans, with much firepower and many helicopters. They operated with stealth and patience, like hunters. They were respected by our forces." That respect came with a price. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy Province inflicted an estimated kill ratio of 10.1 or higher, while controlling an area American intelligence had written off as permanently contested. They achieved this with never more than 8,000 troops, a fraction of American force levels elsewhere in South Vietnam. But the evolution wasn't just tactical. Psychologically, the patrol-based approach created different pressures. American soldiers often described Vietnam as long periods of boredom, punctuated by moments of terror. Australian soldiers described it as constant tension. You were always in enemy territory, always at risk, always alert. Some men thrived in that environment, others broke. Private Tom Richards, after 8 months of continuous patrol duty, described the mental state. You never fully relaxed. Even back at base, you'd wake up at every sound. You'd analyze every shadow. That hyper-alertness kept you alive in the bush, but it wore you down. I saw blokes who were absolutely brilliant on patrol become paranoid wrecks after 12 months. The Australian military brass recognized this and rotated units more frequently than Americans, typically limiting tours to 12 months with R&R breaks every few months. They also maintained unit cohesion. Soldiers deployed and returned with their original battalions, unlike the American individual replacement system. This preserved the hard-won tactical knowledge and trust that made the patrol system work. By late 1966, the Australian approach had proven itself repeatedly. Small patrols, properly trained and supported, could dominate terrain out of all proportion to their numbers. But one question remained. Could they stand and fight when retreat wasn't an option? Could the same principles that made them excellent at avoiding contact help them survive sustained combat? That question would be answered in August 1966 at a rubber plantation called Long Tan. August 18th, 1966, 1540 hours. D Company 6 RAR, 18 men, advancing through a rubber plantation 3 kilometers east of Nui Dat Base. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp commanded 11 platoon on the left flank, 32 men in extended line, maintaining spacing, eyes scanning the geometric rows of rubber trees. The monsoon rain returned with a vengeance. Visibility dropped to 20 meters. Thunder rolled continuously, masking the sound of movement. Everything about the tactical situation violated Australian patrol doctrine. They were moving in company strength, too large, in poor visibility, too risky, through terrain that limited maneuver, too exposed. But intelligence indicated a VC force had shelled Nui Dat the previous night and withdrawn to the east. D Company's mission was to locate and fix the enemy for a larger operation. What intelligence didn't know was that the 275th VC Regiment, reinforced by D Phuoc Tuy Provincial Battalion, somewhere around 2,500 men, had deliberately baited the Australians into exactly this position. At 1540 hours, 11 platoon walked into a perfectly prepared ambush. The firing erupted from 3 sides simultaneously. AK-47s, RPGs, machine guns, mortars. Sharp watched 2 of his men go down in the first seconds. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Later estimates suggested the VC were firing 10,000 rounds per minute in the initial assault. But something remarkable happened. Instead of breaking, 11 platoon executed their immediate action drills. Men hit the ground, returned fire, moved to covered positions, established all-around defense. Within 60 seconds, Sharp had his platoon formed in a defensive position and was radioing his company commander. Major Harry Smith's response revealed the entire Australian tactical philosophy compressed into radio commands. Hold position. Return fire. Artillery is your friend. Use it. D Company faced the ultimate test of their doctrine. They were outnumbered 25-1. They couldn't retreat. The VC had positioned forces to cut off withdrawal routes. They couldn't assault, suicide against such numbers. Their only option was exactly what their training had prepared them for. Hold ground, maintain fire discipline, use supporting arms. For the next 4 hours, 108 Australian infantrymen fought 200 VC soldiers while directing one of the most intensive artillery bombardments of the war. New Zealand artillery batteries fired 3,500 rounds, nearly destroying their gun barrels from the sustained firing rate. Australian mortars fired continuously until tubes glowed cherry red. American helicopters attempted ammunition resupply runs through the storm, pilots flying blind through monsoon conditions. The fighting was primeval. VC soldiers advanced to within grenade range multiple times. Individual positions were overrun and retaken. Private Paul Large single-handedly defended his section's flank with an M60 machine gun until the barrel melted. Sergeant Bob Buick personally led bayonet charges to clear VC from penetrations in the defensive line. But throughout the chaos, the fundamental Australian tactical principles held. Officers and NCOs maintained fire control, ensuring ammunition wasn't wasted. Artillery forward observers continued calling adjustments even under direct fire. Medical staff crawled through the killing zone to treat wounded, following trauma protocols learned at Conungra. At 1900 hours, as darkness fell and the VC prepared their final assault, a Company 6 RR arrived in armored personnel carriers, breaking through the encirclement. The Battle of Long Tan ended with Australian casualties of 17 killed, 25 wounded. VC casualties were estimated at 245 confirmed killed, possibly 500 more wounded or killed by artillery, but not found. The kill ratio, approximately 15.1, stunned military analysts. So did the survival rate. Despite being outnumbered 25-1 and engaged for 4 hours in close combat, over 90% of D Company survived. General Westmoreland visited the battlefield 3 days later. His comments to Australian officers revealed his complete misunderstanding. Good use of firepower, that's what wins battles. Superior American technology and artillery support. But the Australian commanders knew differently. Technology helped, but what won at Long Tan was training, discipline, and doctrine. Every soldier in D Company had spent months on patrol learning fire discipline, immediate action drills, and supporting arms coordination. Those skills, applied under the worst possible conditions, meant the difference between survival and annihilation. Long Tan represented the peak effectiveness of the Australian approach to Vietnam. Small unit excellence, rigorous training, fire discipline, and intelligent use of supporting arms could overcome massive numerical odds. The patrol doctrine that kept 12 men alive in February scaled up to keep 100 men alive in August. But it also represented the ultimate futility of the entire war. D Company killed or wounded possibly 750 VC soldiers at Long Tan. Within 6 weeks, the 275th Regiment was back to full strength with replacements from North Vietnam. The Australians had won the most lopsided tactical victory of the war. It meant absolutely nothing strategically. This was the central tragedy that Australian commanders recognized but couldn't resolve. You could win every fight and still lose the war. Major Brian McFarlane, who served 3 tours in Vietnam, later reflected, "We proved that well-trained infantry using sound tactics could dominate the battlefield, but we couldn't change the strategic reality. We were foreigners fighting to support a government with limited legitimacy against an enemy willing to sustain any casualties to achieve their political goals." The Americans never fully learned the Australian tactical lessons. U.S. doctrine continued emphasizing large-scale operations, massive firepower, and body counts as measures of success. When American officers observed Australian operations, they often dismissed them as too slow or not aggressive enough. A 1967 MACV study examining different tactical approaches concluded, Australian patrol tactics show effectiveness in local area control, but lack scalability for theater-wide operations. Recommended for Special Forces units only. The recommendation missed the point entirely. The Australians weren't trying to scale up their tactics. They were trying to demonstrate that conventional military victory was impossible, that the war required political solutions, not bigger operations. By 1969, Australian commanders were privately expressing doubts about the war's strategic direction. Brigadier Sandy Pearson told his staff, "We're winning our tactical fights. The enemy avoids us, which means we're effective. But avoiding us means they can just operate elsewhere. We can't garrison the entire country. Neither can the Americans, even with 500,000 troops. This war isn't military, it's political. And politically, we're not winning." The final proof came in 1970 and 1971 as Australian forces began withdrawing. Phuoc Tuy Province, which had been relatively secure under Australian control, rapidly reverted to VC influence. All the tactical successes, all the highly effective patrols, all the professionalism, none of it created lasting change because the fundamental strategic approach was flawed. The Australian experience in Vietnam proved that tactical excellence couldn't compensate for strategic failure. They'd developed the most effective small unit tactics of the war. They'd achieved the best kill ratios, the lowest friendly casualty rates, and the highest operational efficiency. And none of it mattered. Corporal Bob Henderson survived his tour and returned to Australia in 1967. He never fired his rifle in combat. His patrol on February 22, 1966, remained his defining military experience. 4 hours of absolute terror managed by rigorous training and discipline. When asked about it years later, he'd simply say, "We did our job. We survived." That's what professionals do. That understated professionalism defined the Australian military contribution to Vietnam. Between 1965 and 1972, roughly 60,000 Australian service members deployed to Vietnam. 521 died, 3,129 were wounded. Their kill ratio approached 10-1, higher than any other Allied forces. In Phuoc Tuy Province, they demonstrated that counter-insurgency doctrine, properly applied, could control contested territory with minimal forces. But they also demonstrated the limits of tactical excellence. The lesson Australia learned wasn't that their tactics failed. It was that no tactics could solve fundamentally political problems with military means alone. The legacy divided into 2 streams. Militarily, Australian tactical methods influenced special operations forces worldwide. The patrol techniques, fire discipline, and small unit excellence became models studied at Sandhurst, West Point, and military academies globally. When American and British forces faced insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, they finally adopted many Australian principles developed in Vietnam, 40 years too late for Vietnam itself. Strategically, Australia learned profound skepticism about foreign military interventions supporting governments with limited legitimacy. When America launched the Iraq War in 2003, Australian commitment was measured in hundreds of troops, not thousands, and focused on specialized training roles rather than large-scale combat operations. The Vietnam experience had taught that military competence couldn't compensate for strategic incoherence. For the men who served, the legacy was more personal and painful. They'd fought professionally, achieved tactical successes, and came home to a nation divided over the war. There were no victory parades, no national celebrations. Many veterans struggled with what they'd experienced and witnessed, not because they fought poorly, they fought superbly, but because their excellence achieved nothing lasting. Lieutenant Jim Shelton, who commanded the patrol in February 1966, later became a military historian. His final assessment was brutally honest. "We proved you could fight a counter-insurgency war effectively. We proved small unit tactics and professionalism could overcome numerical odds. We proved training and discipline mattered. But we also proved that none of those things could win a war that was fundamentally unwinnable militarily. Vietnam required political solutions. We provided military excellence. They weren't the same thing." That unnamed rubber plantation, where Henderson and his patrol called artillery fire danger close, is unmarked today. The firebase that supported them is gone. The jungle has reclaimed the battlefields. But the tactical lessons about professionalism, discipline, training, and the intelligent use of force remain valid. They just remind us that wars are won by political will and legitimate governance, not by military virtuosity alone. 12 men faced 200. They walked away without a scratch. It was a tactical miracle and a strategic irrelevance, which perhaps summarizes the entire Australian experience in Vietnam better than any statistics could.